I'm standing under a picture of Walter Gropius, the man who has shaped the course that modern architecture has taken for 48 years. In 1911, when he was 28, he took his first great leap into the dark, into the future. He built the Fargus factory, and he created a wall which does not support the building but is merely a screen between its supports. He had created the first curtain wall, and this was to become one of the distinctive marks of modern architecture. At one corner, two such walls abutted with no intervening column between. This too was revolutionary, and this he repeated in the famous Bauhaus building of 1925-26. Here the curtain walls wrapped the main building like a giant crystal. Their transparency relates inside to outside, giving a new meaning and likeness to the space in which his teachers and students worked. The Bauhaus was the seeding ground of modern architecture and of much modern art. Among those Walter Gropius gathered around him there, here he is in the dark hat, were, reading left from him, Marcel Breuer, Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee, and Lionel Feininger. Kandinsky and Klee in particular are among the giants of modern art. In 1934, Walter Gropius left Germany and came to England. He stayed there 3 years. In 1937, he came to the United States, and his influence was immediately widespread, showing that he is one of the great teachers of this and indeed of any time. As the senior partner of the Architects Collaborative, TAC, he has received many commissions. One of the most exciting of them is the new building, Baghdad University. The model for this building is a far cry from the large glass surfaces and chastely functional outlines of the Bauhaus. Developing along principles which remain the same, he shows a new capacity for change and what can only be called a new lyricism. This mosque embodies his belief that we must take what is valid from the traditions of the past. Walter Gropius, then, is one of the giants, and I'd like you to meet him. Mr. Gropius, when Mies van der Rohe was speaking some years ago, he said that the Bauhaus was such an influence not because it was a group of men only, or because it was a group of buildings, but because it was an idea. What is that idea?
Well, I think he was very right by seeing it as an idea, and I may tell you perhaps how I have come to this idea. Already as a rather young man, I felt the terrible discrepancy between the beauty of old villages and cities and our chaotic conditions of today. And I wanted to ask myself, what can a single being do to help to improve these conditions? How could we come again to what I call today unity in diversity? Mm-hmm. How can we do that? Of course, I came immediately to the idea it would not depend on a few buildings which I might erect and do, but that something much more deep-going had to be done. I should find a method of approach how we can solve all these innumerable problems of design, and this could be done only with many, many people helping it via a school. Mm-hmm. And so it came to me the idea how such a school should be. Where could I find the teachers? I knew that there were not men in existence anymore who could simultaneously design a new modern chair and execute it also, or any other part of furniture, or even a building. There was a discrepancy between these different categories of men, and how could they be brought together again? So I thought it would be necessary to give each student in such a school one man for the artistic approach and another man for all the technicalities, because it was possible still to find very good craftsmen who knew all the technicalities necessary for that, and they were first-rate artists. And so I brought in artists who had never done anything in craft workshops, but married them, so to speak, with these technicians. And every one of the students learned the two things from two different sides. And in the next generation, there was a crew of men like Marcel Breuer, Herbert Bayer, and several others of the younger crew who were then masters in both, who had gone through all the experiences in art design, were painters themselves often, or architects like Marcel Breuer, and were now able also as teachers in the second half of the Bauhaus to have the workshops in their hand and to teach both the artistic approach as well as the technicalities. And the main thing perhaps of the Bauhaus has been the attempt to find an objective approach for the tools of a designer and an artist. Formerly there were a lot of art schools in Europe where a more or less famous teacher would teach his students his own line. This I thought was not right. We should not educate small editions of ourselves as teachers. We should really find the objective means how this could be done. And so was developed step by step, with the help of all these people in the Bauhaus, an objective approach to find in the art of design those things which could be given as tools to any artist who would be developed in such a school. To give you a little bit of insight what it does mean, when we create a building, we have a room like this one, any room in which any one of you may sit listening to us here. I think you can change the appearance of the room. For instance, when you have a matte black color on your ceiling, it will come down on you. When you have a very attacking color like a bright red or yellow on one wall, it comes closer to you. When it is a dark color, it goes away from you. So you can let a space appear in a different way than it is in reality of dimensions and materials and so on. The artist had many means also of optical illusions to let things appear different from what they are in reality. And this, as a basic method of teaching, has been worked out to many, many details. The initial man in the Bauhaus was Johannes Itten, who came from Switzerland, and he has laid the foundation stones for this course, which now I think I can say has been accepted in the whole world.
Now, may I ask you something about that? You did produce a set of objective principles which were accepted all over the world and which affected buildings from Tokyo to Europe. Well, now, this has resulted in a type of architecture that has been named the international style. Now, do you believe that there is an international style?
No, I have always fought against this expression because I think it is wrong.
Why?
Because the approach which we tried was to start from the human being and to study the human being in his surroundings. Now, the surroundings are very different when I go to Texas or California or when I go to Massachusetts. So I have to study the man in the region where he is. I have to study the climate, any conditions of customs of the people living there and so on. And in former times it was also the material, but today it doesn't play that role because the exchange of materials all throughout the world is such that it doesn't play the role as formerly. But the climatic conditions, of course, play a big role. So this is regional approach and not an international approach. And I think it's a wrong connotation to call it international style. There's, of course, a common denominator of international denomination in the whole thing. That is the technique which we have today in the modern world and which by our extraordinary means of communication have been distributed all over the world from one country to the other.
I see. Well, now, you, sir, I want to ask you another question. And I'm not going to turn you into a grand old man, because you've been fighting for ideas all your life, and I want you to fight for them now.
Very good.
And that is collaboration. Now, this country has been above all the individualist country, the country for the single man. The single man creates here. Well, now you are part of a corporation which is a number of people coming together to create one building. Well, do you not think that the building loses its artistic impulse in there? A building, like a work of art, does come from a single person, doesn't it?
Yeah. I deeply believe in teamwork, but it is perfectly all right what you say. The spark comes always from the individual. The idea comes from an individual. But now imagine that you have built up a team which is not commanded by somebody, but which is built up on the free will of you or me, that we select a few people who like each other and want to do a big task together. And they come together and discuss this every day, every day. In the end, I do not know anymore whether this or that idea has come from me, or whether my neighbor has made a remark which has stimulated me to another thought. So I think such a complex thing like a building in which so many technicalities and artistic problems altogether come into the open, a discussion in a group which really know each other and work very well, is bringing the result higher up than when a man is sitting alone in an ivory tower. I may tell you perhaps a little nice story which I have experienced with Frank Lloyd Wright, who of course was on the other end, on the other pole, so to speak. He was a very strong individualist and didn't believe in teamwork. And we both were invited once for the opening of the big university in Mexico City by the Mexican government. And I was staying with a friend of mine, an architect in the Pedregal in the vicinity, and he gave a dinner to my honor and invited several Mexican architects and also Mr. Frank Lloyd Wright. And I, before Frank Lloyd Wright arrived, I happened to discuss this hobby of mine, the teamwork, and he came in and saw what I did and grinned and said, "Go right ahead, Walter," and sat on my side. And when I had finished, he said, "But Walter, when you want to make a child, you don't ask the help of your neighbor, or do you?" And I thought fast and said, "If the neighbor happens to be a woman, I might." And that was the time we had the last word, which happened very rarely with Frank Lloyd Wright, who was very witty and good with
Yes.
the word.
Well, let's talk about Frank Lloyd Wright for just a moment. Do you think he was a great architect, a great man, or a great romantic, or a great idea?
Perhaps everything which you say is true with him.
I think he was a great man.
He definitely was a great man, a genius of great capacity. I've found very often that there are great discrepancies in his whole build-up, that he hasn't been consistent very often. But that, I think, happens always with a genius, that the surprising things come in.
Mm-hmm. Any example you can think of there?
Pardon?
Is there any example you can think of in there?
Well, I think the one outstanding example, which is also in this exhibition here, is the Johnson Wax Factory. Wright was also very inventive as a technician, and he invented a new column which nobody had done yet. The engineers said, "You can't do that, it will not hold." Wright was not easily discouraged, so he went and made a test. And the test result was that the column was 6.5 times as strong as it should be for carrying the load which was calculated for. And then when everything was done, he used this column in the big hall of the Johnson Wax Factory, where these columns don't carry anything but standing free with glass in between the capitals. A very beautiful hall, no doubt, but there's an inconsistency in using structural parts which are so ingeniously invented, not for their purpose, but only as a decorative element.
I see.
These are the things which sometimes puzzle when you analyze a work of Wright. Mm-hmm. But he was so full of ideas that I think he has given a whole generation many things to live with.
Now, Wright was a great individualist, and you have at all times have had this immense capacity of unifying a group, of working with a group, of getting them to work together, people of different interests, of diverse character. Is there any one clue, idea that you have? What is the secret of this?
Well, I think in everything you do together in a group, we need a certain humbleness of all together, not to want to be too much in the foreground, because when it is a team which works together, this being connected from one man to another is in the foreground, and not that one should be singled out. And so if you keep back and not go too much into the foreground, it will be possible that you work with others, because our natural vanity, of course, is played down that way when you work in a team. And the more objective such a group will work, with a large task above them, the better it will be to do it in this way, as I try to line out, because the natural vanity goes down when you work in a group like that. You control each other that way. Because when you come to objective things only, which you discuss with each other, and I mean with objective things also certain solutions from the artistic point of view, you have something direct in which you can go in discussing it. And of course we discuss not only with the word, but also with the pencil and on a big blackboard and so on when we do these things. And in the Architects Collaborative, we have sometimes big fights with each other.
Yes.
And I should emphasize that in such a teamwork, any job is always under a job captain. And this job captain has the last word. So we criticize very sharply what he brings into our weekly sessions. But he's still after that free to take it or leave it.
I see.
So the continuity
Is
of
in there all the
one
time.
inventive brain is still kept.
Well, now I'd like to move on to something else that you said, and that was at one time that we must connect with what is valid for us in the tradition of the past. Now, you also said, when we were talking a few moments ago, that at present there is chaos. Well, now, what is valid in the tradition of the past for us, and what have you picked in your own work that brings out that validity?
Well, not long time ago, I read a remark Einstein has made shortly before his death, where he said, "Perfection of means and confusion of aims is characteristic of our time." This hits right the spot, because the times which we admire so very much are former times where there was a great unity of expression and form, where everyone followed a certain line and did not go another way, although there was great intensity of individual doings within that common denominator. There was a, so to speak, a moral background which was so strong that certain things were done and other things were not done. We are today in a very chaotic time where we don't find these conditions anymore. We tried, in my opinion, in the wrong way from outside. When you look into our industry today, where organization men play such a role, where a robotization of society takes place, there I see a real danger, particularly for our cultural things, because cultural things can live and grow only when the individual is strong. But within a common denominator, which everyone abides by it, there's enough play for the individual to find his own personal expression. And we should emphasize this personal expression. So a difference within a greater whole, which is a unity.
I see. Well, now,
Unity in diversity, I call it.
Unity and diversity. Well, what do you think is most important for modern architects to remember? Is there some principle, is there some byword? You have always looked on the human side of architecture. Is that?
Well, I definitely think so. As we build for human beings, we have to study psychologically how a human being lives. For instance, I am against giving a young student in architecture right away a normal house to design, because I think it's one of the most difficult things to do, because you have to envisage with much imagination how a family through the whole circle of the family life would live. Starts a young couple, then small babies come. The babies are becoming tots, and then they become adolescents, and the adolescents turn topsy-turvy everything in the house, and then they go and leave the house, and the old people remain. And this vessel house has to fulfill all these requirements which change all the time through the cycle of life. And you need very much imagination to envisage how it will work in all these different stages. Or when you build a museum, in my opinion, we have to study the visitor of the museum We want him to be more receptive, to go into a museum and see in a rather short time great many masterworks. Now, how can I make it more receptive? One of the basic truths when you study a human being is that we live from contrast. Little difference of contrast in the weather and everything we have gives us little kicks in life which let us experience more. And that is what we need also for the man who goes in the museum. I would bring him in one bright room, and after that I would bring him in a dark room where there are only a few spotlights so that he can relax. And then he comes again in another room and is refreshed again. These refreshing moments are necessary. Or take our air conditioning as it is today. It is much too even. The engineers think when it is the very best temperature and the very best air velocity, it is constantly that way, it is good. It is not, because nature is different. We need changes in temperature, changes in moisture degree, and changes in velocity of air. Then we feel well. Just as when we open a window and we get a little bit of draft in when it is hot inside. And the ideal constant thing is not good. Nor when you have the light in a museum. I found once a pamphlet in which the lighting engineers of this country said we are now so far advanced in artificial light that we don't need any more for exhibits the natural light. We can do it with artistic light, with artificial light. But of course the artificial light is static. And I want to see a picture today in sunny light and tomorrow in the dark.
You want to see a building too?
Pardon?
Isn't that one of the charms of a building too,
yes,
that you have mentioned, with the light?
Yes.
The light changes?
Yes.
Yes.
For instance, I want to mention that people fight today either having large windows or small windows in a residential house. Now why? We can make them very large and then have several devices to close up half or partly, so that just according to our mood we are able to change the conditions. That's what all the modern techniques have brought to us. But that always goes back to the human being and how he makes use of these things. And I would not be satisfied to create, as it was called, universal space and leave it then to the human beings using that space just as they see fit. I want to go further and want to study all the necessities in that house from the practical as well as from the psychological point of view. There I would like still to mention that this word functionalism has been so very much misrepresented today. In my opinion, the functional architecture is not an architecture which is a practical thing, which follows only the practical lines, but much more than that. There's also, our psyche has also to function. So we have to look into the functional problems of our psyche. When I talked before about handling a room in order to make it comfortable for us by warm or cold colors and by colors which attack and those who go back. Mm-hmm. This is all a psychological effect on us and human beings, and that is also a function. So we have to take that in this connotation of functionalism. Mm-hmm. It's not a practical thing alone. And this has to be emphasized very much so, because it has been misunderstood again and again by many writers also. The Bauhaus has been misrepresented as being only following this practical line. Now, I would never have brought men like Klee and Kandinsky into the Bauhaus if this would have been the basic idea, to bring only practical things out of this institute.
Why did you bring Klee and Kandinsky? Did you know them?
I knew of they were rather unknown still at that time when we started out with that in 1918, 1920. But I knew, of course, the pictures of all the modern painters, and I liked them, so I picked them out and I asked my friends what they thought of it, and then I went to see them, and I would only those take into our Bauhaus circle who fulfilled certain human qualities, and these were great men also from the human point of view.
Well, now that brings us to something that deeply interests many of us, and that is the relation between the artist and the architect. And you got there two men who are extremely personal artists. Did you find it possible to work in close cooperation with them?
Well, I have worked with several of the artists of the Bauhaus in several buildings, and I must say, after we worked years together in the Bauhaus, there was a possibility of understanding from one to the other. I wouldn't say with every one of them, but at least with some of them. Whereas today we make so very often the mistake that a building is designed completely or even built completely, and then we call in from there an artist to fill a certain surface with a wall picture or a sculpture as a relief on the wall and so on. And then we are disappointed that it doesn't work as it did in the old Gothic cathedrals and so on, where it was really unity of the whole. You couldn't separate it.
I know. Now, I'd like to ask you one question. It's one that I personally want to know. I love Klee's work, and I'd have loved to have met him. What is your predominant memory of Paul Klee?
Paul Klee, strangely enough, was the most respected personality in the Bauhaus. There were quarrels from the students to the teachers all the time, and everyone was in one time or the other. Never Klee. Klee was rather restrained. He didn't get very much into the proscenium in the Bauhaus, so to speak, but when there was a difficult problem and Klee was asked, he had always a very precise answer, and always with a very strong moral background.
I see. Kandinsky is a fascinating figure too. What do you remember most about Kandinsky?
Kandinsky had a very different way of teaching than Klee had, perhaps much more systematic. Klee started a certain systematic only when he came to the Bauhaus and had to teach. Then he started to build something up. But Kandinsky had worked theoretically already much further back, many years back, and had written several things. And within the Bauhaus, he built that out more and more and gave it to the students. And any one of these had also a workshop. So it was not only a study in painting, although Klee as well as Kandinsky had some private students who belonged to the Bauhaus and were also painting. But they were heads of a workshop. And all these people working in the workshop worked in one workshop with Klee, another with Kandinsky, and a third with Moholy-Nagy.
Moholy-Nagy, we know so little about him over here. Do you think he was a great artist?
Yes, I think he was a great artist, and perhaps his strongest side was that he was so many-sided. I think I miss very much that no museum has yet dared to show an exhibition of a man like Moholy-Nagy with the many faces of his work, painting and sculpture and architecture and film, and show a section through the whole work of a man, because the many-sidedness gives us very many indications of what is happening today in the artistic world. When we only take the painting of one man or only the sculpture, it is not enough.
I'm sorry to interrupt you here, sir. I wish we could talk forever. You've been listening to Walter Gropius, a great man who inspires not only respect, but also affection.
This is NET National Educational Television.